If you wish to post anything on social media, please use hashtag MCC Budapest Lectures. Should you be in need of that, you can collect translator devices at the registration desk. Please return it at the end. Thank you for our panelists for joining us, accepting our invitation and joining us for tonight's discussion. First, I would like to introduce you Anthony Daniels, who is also Theodore Dalrymple, as his pen name is. He's a British author, psychiatrist, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor at the City Journal. Please welcome him. Roland Freudenstein is a German political scientist, policy director of the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies. Welcome. Igor Janke is a Polish journalist and writer, president of the independent think tank, the Freedom Institute of Warsaw, partner at the communication consultancy R4S. Welcome. Boris Kalnoky is a returning guest of ours, the journalist, foreign correspondent for Die Welt, Weltwoche, Kleine Zeitung, Deutsche Welle, and Cicero. Welcome. And Joseph Pearce, who is a British-American writer and publicist, director of book publishing at the Augustine Institute, and senior contributor at the Imaginative Conservative. Welcome, Joseph. So let's begin with the discussion on the topic of Christian democracy. It's a rather ambiguous term. I don't think that it would be an exaggeration, because it has two elements, Christian and democracy, which were to be defined on their own as well. But if we put them together, it's probably even more blurry what we can understand under this term. So I would turn at this point to our experts, the speakers, to please define this term and try to shed some light on what we can understand under Christian democracy. Please, Tony, if you can start.
Do you want me to speak what sure. I prepared? Or is it, how long?
So I already asked our speakers to keep their answers very short, since we have 5 speakers plus the moderator on the stage. So probably in just a few 4 or 5 minutes, if you could share your preliminary thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very grateful to be asked to come here. Personally, I think the idea of Christian democracy as a political force in Europe is now virtually impossible for a number of reasons. I'm not sure I can define it, except, of course, that there are Christian democratic parties. But as a distinct ideology, I don't really see its future. I come from Britain, and I live some of the time in France. These countries are completely secularized now. And in fact, the idea of something being Christian is not merely alien now to people, but people are hostile to it. They're actually hostile, and if you go to Ireland, for example, which one would have thought was a strongly Catholic country, there has been a kind of Gestalt switch, and there is active hostility, certainly amongst the most important part of the population, to Catholicism. So that, for example, in Dublin, and this is astonishing to me because I went to Ireland when I was very young, when priests were still very important people in their communities, the most important people in their communities. Priests in Dublin will not walk out in priestly costume because they are likely to be insulted or even attacked. The important thing for me is actually that certain of the Christian virtues have to be recovered by Europe. I do believe that, but I don't think that they can be captured, recaptured through any specific Christian identity or political party. And I'm talking now about, I don't know what the situation is in Hungary, but I think that that is the case in Britain and France and Ireland. I don't know about other countries, I don't know about Germany. So I have my answer to Christian there. The answer is, it is an emptying term. But that is not the same as saying that Christian ideas or ideals have nothing to say. And I say this as someone who is not myself a believer. And I can go in later to explain why I think certain ideals are important and why we are in actually a very difficult situation in most of Europe because of a kind of militant liberalism, which is actually very thin and very unsatisfying as a basis for any society.
Shall I? All right. I beg to differ. I don't think things are as gloomy as Anthony described. And let me just share with you a story about my party, the Christian Democratic Union of Germany, CDU. You might know that in the European elections, the CDU got quite a beating, and especially in the days before the European election, you might not know, that's why I'm telling you. Actually, the CDU went through a couple of communication disasters with some influencers on social media. So what happened like 4 weeks ago was that, if you imagine the CDU headquarters in Berlin, which is quite a dashing, daring architectural object, with three big letters in front, a C, a D, and a U. And Greenpeace, through some pirate operation, actually managed to take the C away in broad daylight, claiming that they have to somehow renew the letters or something, and they just took the C off, and then started a PR campaign saying the C has left the CDU. And you have to know that the question about the C, the Christian, in the name CDU has been for decades an object of a subject of debate. Is the CDU still a Christian party or not? Anyway, so the C was hijacked by Greenpeace activists, and lo and behold, the CDU had a communication strategy to answer to this kind of emergencies. And I mean, they tweeted all kinds of funny things, such as, "Dear C, we don't mind your having a little bit on the side. And actually, if Greenpeace puts you into their living room, it might have a benedictional effect on them." Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, it's quite a name for an election poster, AKK, said, "Oh, we're so happy to lend the C to Greenpeace. They might actually need it." And, you know, this kind of cool reaction actually was judged by leftist German media as quite a nice reaction. And why am I telling this story? I think there are actually communication strategies to cope with what you called secularization, the total absence of Christianity in our countries. Now, actually, being German, living in Belgium, I haven't heard of priests being beaten up for wearing their clothes, and I do not think that Christianity is disappearing from public life in Germany or Belgium. There certainly is a change in electorates. The classical, very often rural, church-affiliated, socially conservative electorate is dissolving, like all other stable electorates are dissolving in Europe. So all parties have to compete with new methods like the one I gave you in this little example story. And let me just finish with one remark. Christian democracy is a set of ideas. It is not a form of government. Now, I'm referring to something that the ruling party in Hungary, Fidesz, has been saying over the last couple of years, that You know, in 2014, Viktor Orbán started talking about the illiberal state and that he's opposed to liberal democracy. And a couple of years later, he changed the word illiberal to Christian and saying, instead of liberal democracy, we want Christian democracy. Well, sorry, Mr. Orbán. That is an intellectual shell game. Liberal democracy means majority rule with checks and balances, with strong and independent institutions, a judiciary, free media, and a robust civil society that is unhindered by the government. That's liberal democracy. Christian democracy is a set of political ideas that arose in the 19th century based on social Catholic teachings, Catholic social teachings, which combined a degree of social welfare but separate from the state, with a certain social conservatism in social life. And today, in the party I grew up in, the German CDU, actually the German CDU's platform reads, our roots are in liberalism, conservatism, and Christian social thinking. In that sequence, by the way. So, and liberalism was an ally of Christian democracy in Germany as long as I can remember, or a potential ally. So I don't know what this anti-liberal fuss is all about.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm quite pessimistic, and but what we have to say at the beginning that I think we all agree that today's Europe is a creation of Christian Democrats. They have built it. Christian Democrats were architects of the European Union and of the transatlantism. The ideas and political activity of Schuman, Adenauer, and de Gasperi were crucial for building the new European unity after the war. They built the fundamentals of the political and economic order which that prevailed in the Western Europe after 1945, and they also had played a crucial role in the process of extending the free and democratic sphere to the east, to our countries, when the communists collapsed. And they were very successful for years, and very successful and influential. And what's the reason? I think that was the very attractive blend of traditional family values, the welfare state, anti-communism, and democracy, and the Christianity as a cultural code. I think this blend was very attractive for the post-war societies in Western Europe. But now, Christian Democrats are not able to keep the stable today's Europe, which is torn apart by so many crises. And I don't want to blame just Christian Democrats. I mean, there's no political group or ideology which found a good answer for today's challenges. I'm just stating that this great political family which has built the new order in the post-war Europe is not capable to maintain the order anymore. And as a political movement, but also as a set of ideas, Christian democracy is becoming less and less influential and attractive for many Europeans, and less coherent. I think there are several reasons, yeah, and I think we'll discuss maybe the reasons later. But I think the parties suffer from an identity crisis. You know, they seem to undermine their roots, the Christian roots. And of course, there are many. If I were politicians, probably also I would try to forget it. But then the party is becoming less and less reliable, not only for the very old traditionals, the whole Europe is facing several challenges because we are losing the compass, yeah? And it applies not only to Christian Democrats, but we have to answer the question together. I mean, people from the East, from the West, and Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, where we are heading. What kind of Europe we are willing to live? What kind of Europe we are willing to live in the future? Because we have several answers, several different answers, and there is no one which now is helping us to build a stable political sphere.
Working? Push anything? Oh no, it works like okay. Well, good evening. Welcome to everyone. And I am, I think, less erudite than my friends here on the podium. I'm a journalist, and I think I will try to formulate some very simple thoughts. One is that Christian democracy, historically and functionally, was a reaction to a very rapid and brutal transformation of the economy and the society in Europe in the 19th century. These were developments that threatened to blow up all of society and the church, as it were, and more conservative circles tried to find something to moderate that change and keep it within certain limits. In that sense, it's interesting to compare with our situation today, where again we are in the throes of a very rapid societal and economic change, and the key question is really how do we manage that without our societies being damaged. So here's one thing. I agree that it's probably impossible to think about the future of Christian democracy in a society without any Christians. It doesn't make any sense. It is the reason why social democracy is collapsing before our eyes. It's because the core of its constituency, the people who made it up, blue-collar workers, strata of society that demanded redistribution of wealth, in a society where wealth was very unequally distributed. There are hardly any blue-collar workers left. We have a different society today, and so this is one of the reasons for the crisis of social democracy. Christian democracy without Christians will also suffer from the question of identity. So if political parties used to be more than today, perhaps, but also a place where you feel at home. Certainly so in Germany, where we had Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, and that was it, basically. And you were a Social Democrat because your parents had been and their parents had been, and you were a Christian Democrat for the same reason. That's all disappearing. So, but I do think that a political force that aims to manage rapid change in a sensible manner without risking disruptive change and revolution, I think that kind of political movement we will always have, possibly in the future without any reference to Christian roots. We'll have to see. One thing I want to mention is that there's a big difference between Christian democratic culture in Eastern Europe or Central Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And if you have grown up in Western Europe, you will not understand the political connotations of the whole thing here in Central Eastern Europe. Liberalism as one root of Christian democracy, as you stated, Mr. Freudenstein, in the West developed as freedom for the individual against oppression by the aristocracy, by maybe an abusive church hierarchy, by the monarchy. So it is something individual. Freedom in our countries here has a much more collective connotation to it. It's freedom for society to shape its own destiny against potential aggression from foreign influence. And we regard it here, or many of us regard it as the last line of defense of the nation against Russian occupation, Turkish occupation, Nazi occupation, two of them atheist, one of them Muslim. So here there's a much more national reference to the idea of Christian democracy in our countries. Lastly, the relationship between nation and Christian democracy, I think the concept of Christian democracy is not dependent on the concept of the nation state. Christianity was here long before the notion of the nation state was. Hopefully it will still be with us long after the notion of nation state will not be here anymore. However, in our countries here in Eastern Europe, there is a connection between Christian culture and the idea of nation. That's it.
Well, I think I'm somewhat more optimistic than many of the other panelists. I believe that the theology of pride, which is basically in the ascendant in Europe at the moment, is self-destructive. The old adage, the pride precedes the fall. I think that the trajectory on which Western liberalism is on is unsustainable and is going to implode upon itself. So what we have to do is be catalysts for renewal and revival and restoration. And we need to be thinking about these things in radical ways. We need to not fall into the trap of a sort of a set trajectory of progress towards an unknown future, because that's not what history shows us. It tends to go in cycles. And if, in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, by 1989, there have been 72 years of enforced atheism in Russia. There's no living memory of a Russian Christendom. You would have predicted realistically that there's no hope for a restoration of any meaningful form of Christianity in Russian culture. And now we see, 20 years later, that on the contrary, there are signs of a resurrection. In England, after 300 years of persecution of the Catholic Church, following the conversion of St. John Henry Newman in 1845, we had an English Catholic revival, which for the next century produced some of the finest works of literary art. And by the 1930s, there were tens of thousands of adult converts to the Catholic faith. So I happen to believe that the Christians have a God who knows the way out of the grave, and I believe that Christianity is capable of resurrection, and it will be Christianity that restores Europe. And I would also like to say that to get radical about things and talk about Christian democracy in terms of the two terms. Christianity ultimately is about love, and not love in the sense that John Lennon understands the word. Love is not an irrational feeling, but a rational choice. To love is to freely choose to lay down your life for the other, for your neighbor. And so a Christian understanding of society is one where responsibility circumscribes rights. And really rights should be to protect the weakest members of society and not to empower the strong. And what we're finding now is that rights empower the strong to the ultimate detriment of the weakest members of society, which is why we see the killing of children, where we will see soon the systematic killing of old people. This is where the philosophy of pride is leading. As regards democracy, the most important thing about democracy is it has to empower people to have real power over their own lives and their own destiny, their own political destiny. And that means that democracy has to be human scale. And the problem we have today is macro democracies where the government is further and further away from the people, where the people are basically disenfranchised effectively, de facto, if not de jure. So, for instance, the federal government in the United States is so far removed from the ordinary people, it ceased to be democratic in any meaningful sense of the word. The two-party state over there is not democratic in any meaningful sense of the word. And I would argue the European Union is also being centered a long way from the ordinary peoples of Europe in Brussels, a long way away from the people. And I see that the national sovereignty as an important act of subsidiarity to bring democracy back to the grassroots and get democracy back to ordinary people.
Thank you for all the different approaches which you brought on the table. At this point, I would suggest to dig deeper for the historical roots of Christian democracy. You already touched upon this, but probably those who would like to contribute more to the subject on the historical roots and the changes since then. So the 19th and 20th century roots of Christian democracy, the historical background, and also the whole process, how it went on and where we arrived at the moment and why we are here, so understand a bit more where we actually kicked off from. I would like to start with a quote at this question from a Canadian-American academic, John Witt. Quote, "Both Protestant and Catholic parties inveighed against the reductionist extremes and social failures of liberal democracies and social democracies. Liberal democracies, they believed, had sacrificed the community for the individual. Social democracies had sacrificed the individual for the community. Both parties returned to traditional Christian teachings of social pluralism or subsidiarity, which stressed the dependence and participation of the individual in family, church, school, business, and other associations. Both parties stressed the responsibility of the state to respect and protect the individual in community." Please, I would like to ask you how you would react on these thoughts and on the origins of Christian democracy.
Thank you. Well, again, I totally object to the way liberal democracies, social democracies, and Christian democracies are used in this sentence. I don't know what he's talking about. If he says liberals and social democrats and Christian democrats, I think that's really what he means. So I would like to stick to that. But, the German term for West, poetically speaking, is called Abendland, the evening lands, because that's where the sun sets, as opposed to the East, where the sun rises. Now, what's the definition of Abendland? And I think it tells us a lot about how, how Christianity can define itself and its role in the public sphere. So here's a story about three hills: Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. And what do they stand for? Jerusalem is the road from Judaism to Christianity. God takes on a human form and therefore gives the foundation of human dignity and therefore of the equal value of all human beings. And that is, if you want, a very individualistic way of looking at the world and of defining the human being. It's not the collective that counts, it's each human person. Athens is doubt, is philosophy, is reason, a reasoned dialogue, is criticism, is questioning things. And Rome is law, also the rule of law, and to an extent a very early form of checks and balances, strong and independent institutions. So you can derive the essentials of the Western polity from these three hills of Christian and Western tradition, if you want. And I think that's a very, very important precondition for defining what Christian democracy is today and what it is based on, in fact. And indeed, as Boris said, Christian Democrats, without Christian Democrats, we wouldn't have the process of European integration. Because in relativizing the nation state, they laid the foundations for nations not disappearing, but exercising elements of state sovereignty on the basis of jointly created law. And that's the shortest definition that I've ever heard about what European integration is all about. And yes, in Central Europe there are different traditions. By the way, I've lived in Poland for 7 years. And I know that certain terms are understood differently. Perfectly well aware of it. And yet, why shouldn't political parties and citizens in Central Europe subscribe to the notion of European integration that I've just outlined. I see no reason why. And in fact, when you say we in Central Europe, you know, there are very different forces in this part of Europe, just like there are very different forces in Western Europe. There are many admirers of the current Hungarian government in countries like France and Italy. And there are many political parties that are fairly successful even recently, and they may one day even more successful in Central Europe, that have a different notion from the current governments of Poland and Hungary about European integration. So the determinism, the fatalism that this part of Europe thinks differently about concepts like freedom, the nation, and Europe, it's something I would see very relatively.
I would like to beg to differ up to a point on our understanding of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. I would like to see it from the perspective of how the magisterium of the church sees it. That Jerusalem is the root of faith, that Athens is the root of reason, not doubt. That through the ideas of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, we have concepts of the good, the true, and the beautiful that parallel beautifully with the Christ's reference to himself as I am the way, the truth, and the life. And that unity between faith and reason is at the heart of Western civilization. And Rome was providentially put in place, was conquered by the ideas of Greece, and then conquered by the ideas of the Christians, providentially put in place as the conduit by which Christendom spread throughout Europe. So I think my understanding of that healthy trinity of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome differs somewhat from my good friend.
I would just like to say one thing, because I was mentioned personally. We don't tend to view our views here as fatalist. We're proud of the views that we hold. There's no fatalism in there. And of course, we is not everyone in Hungary or in Poland or in Czechia or in Slovakia. Of course, it's a vibrant, multifaceted society. All I want to say is that there are views in these societies about nation, freedom, and faith that, as a whole, tend to be somewhat different or more widespread in larger parts of society than in England or France or Germany. That's really all I wanted to say.
Well, I don't think that we differ in understanding of freedom, especially in my country than Germany and other countries. I mean, Poles are freedom lovers. They fought for freedom many times, and hasn't changed even last.
Even together with us.
Even together with you, yes.
Long time ago.
Yeah. And now we're standing together in the same allies, political and security allies. But what I wanted to mention that it's a different perception and feeling about nation state, and church. Yeah? And it's different, I think, also between a little bit. There are some differences between even Poland and Hungary, because I mean, one cannot understand Poland and the Poland sensitivities without. I know that you know it for sure. That, but not everybody realize how important role Catholic Church played in the history of Polish nation. How much the priests and the church as an institution helped to maintain a Polish national identity in the difficult times when we were under several occupations until communist collapse in the 19th century and in the 20th century until 1989. So in this, I mean, if we think about Christian Democrats and the perception of nations, for example, in Germany, yeah, when people were trying to escape from the notion of national because of the history, and we had completely different attitudes because we were losing our nationalities several times, and we were dreaming for that. Yeah, together with the church. So this attitude might be different, but we have to try to understand and respect each other, also if we have completely different visions.
Well, I would just like to mention Ireland again, which is a very interesting case and possibly of some interest to Poles, because of course in Ireland, Catholicism was very important for the achievement of independence from Britain. But it has collapsed completely. And one of the reasons it's collapsed completely, I think, is that it was too closely, Catholicism, the Catholic hierarchy, was too closely allied with the state. And when liberalism spread in Ireland, and Ireland was actually a very illiberal state after independence, it was seen as an oppressor in turn. So first the British were the oppressors, and now in Irish historiography, the Catholic Church is seen as an oppressor, with the result that it has collapsed almost completely, not quite completely, of course, but almost completely as a force. After independence, the real ruler of Ireland was it is said, Irish people will say, was the Archbishop of Dublin. And no legislation would be passed without the Archbishop's permission. That's one thing I would say. The second thing is that the hold, and I think this is very important, the hold of a certain kind of liberal outlook on the world is extremely strong in our countries. And I'll give you an example from my experience as a doctor. When I used to say to my medical students that I did not think that health care was a human right. No one has a right, in my view, to health care. One and all, they would say, well, do you think that people should just die in the street? Just be allowed to die? And I would say, can you think of any reason why people should not be allowed to die in the street, other than that they have a right to health care, a human right to health care? And they couldn't think of any reason at all. No reason entered their minds at all. And I'm afraid I think this is a very general problem in our countries. Maybe it's not so in Hungary and Poland. So that everything is seen in terms of rights, of conflict, and of course conflicting rights. And I think it's a struggle against that very, in my view, very thin view of what a society can be, that we have to try and give a more realistic view of how a society should and can be. And while I think Christians obviously can contribute to that, I don't think it's uniquely Christian. The idea that what I've just described, a society which is based on an increasing number of rights, is viable. I don't think that that is a specifically Christian point of view, and I think secularists can take that view as well.
Just one thought. I want to tell a little story, anecdote from Turkey, where I worked for 9 years. A 15-year-old kid was riding on a bicycle, drinking cola, and threw away the empty can on the street. A car stopped. The driver lowered his window, and he said, "Pick that up at once and throw it into a bin." And his wife asked the driver, "Well, why do you stop to tell the kid that?" And he said, "Because if I don't do it, it will be bad for my country." Now, that spirit that we take care of each other, and there is something that binds us as a society, and we pay attention to what the other does, and that's something that keeps us together as the fabric of society. Part of that is in Europe, I suppose it would be Christian values. Well, we have that in Hungary to some degree. We tend to tell each other to not do this and yes, do that, and it can be really annoying. But it is something important, I think, and something that liberals don't have. But Christian political culture does maybe have it.
I completely disagree. I mean, this global statement, liberals are bad people, liberals don't, the liberals are opposed to solidarity with each other as a nation or something, is way too sweeping. It really depends which country you look at. I mean, of course, the United States in the 1960s or 70s would have had many instances of what you described, and yet, and not only in the Bible Belt, by the way. So I mean, to say that liberals destroy the nation is quite a simplification that I absolutely reject.
I think we are not arguing for something that is illiberal, by contrast. All one is saying is that once the idea that everything can be regulated through rights as decided by law, which is a situation which is increasing, at least in Britain and other countries, is not a viable basis for a decent society, and leads to immense conflicts, actually. Again, I talk from my clinical experience. I had people who killed their neighbors because of the noise they made. Now, if you go to someone and say you're making too much noise in Britain, in a large number of cases, the person will say, I have a right to make this noise, irrespective of your right to silence. So what you get is a conflict between two different rights, my right to silence, your right to make some noise. And this is increasingly the mindset of people. I don't have a solution. I'm not saying I have a solution, but I've seen this over and over again.
Please.
You know, maybe we can all go back to the Holy Inquisition.
Yes, we shall move on. Sorry. So, of course, you will have a chance to answer this question as well. But I think that the Christian character of Christian democracy should be elaborated on, because it's really not the same if we are talking about just democracy or Christian democracy, and why is it Christian at all? So, what are true Christian Democrats of today like, and what do they stand for? We should really understand what Christian means in this term, because I think there are clashing approaches and ideas among the panelists on the term Christian and the notion Christian. And what is the reason for that? So what is the reason for having entirely different views of groups lining up for the same idea? So Christian democracy for the CDU, or in America, or Europe, in the Americas, in South America. Please add to this on the notion of Christianity in Christian democracy.
Well, I would begin by saying that to be a Christian is actually to subscribe to the creed of Christendom, which is in the West is Catholic Christianity. I believe that to be a Christian is to be Orthodox. It's to believe in the Incarnation. It's to believe in the Trinity. It's to believe in the magisterium of the Church. And Chesterton said, G.K. Chesterton said, we don't want a church that will move with the world. We want a church that will move the world. And for that to be the case, we have to have people with faith and that they understand the connection between faith and reason, and being at one with great modern Catholic thinkers such as Pope Benedict XVI, with his critique of modernity. And I think that is the Christianity which is dynamic enough in its orthodoxy to change the world for the better. But if we're talking about Christianity and water, or to be even more provocative, what has been condemned by the church as the heresy of modernism, that basically the church has to move with the world and change with whatever the political climate is in some sort of pragmatic sense, then Christianity loses its power and ultimately loses its meaning.
Angela
Sorry,
Merkel.
just to come on with one question, sorry, to follow up. What about the current Pope Francis?
Yes, the history of the Church shows that the Church, the magisterium of the Church, the mystical body of Jesus Christ, which is what the Church is larger than any Pope. And I lament the fact that this Pope's papacy is marked by what can best be described as incoherence.
All right. Angela Merkel was asked, what is Christian democracy, at a press conference here in Hungary at one, I don't know, it was 2015 maybe. And she elaborated, and by the time she had finished, there was nothing in politics that was not Christian Democrat. It was everything. It's the ecology, it's liberalism, it's conservatism, it's everything. There's no such thing in politics that is not Christian Democrat. And this obviously is what makes the great power of the CDU in Germany, that it is so multifaceted, and also why the European People's Party as a Christian democratic family of parties is so big, because it encompasses everything. Now, the problem is that when you have such a vast assembly of ideas and minds, then it can become too big and tensions can arise. And we witnessed that since last year, when we had huge discussion in the European People's Party about the character of Christian democracy. And it nearly blew the whole thing apart. Behind the scenes, since then, people have EPP representatives have been asking the Hungarian Fidesz party as a member of EPP to stop one thing. Stop trying to move the European People's Party and Christian democracy to the right. Stop insisting on Christianity, on nation, etc. Because not just the European People's Party as such is such a wide construction, and it will tear it apart, but also because in every Christian democratic party, in every country, in the West at least, it's just the same thing. There's liberals, conservatives, slightly progressives, etc., etc. So it tears at the fabric of not just the EPP, but every one of these parties. So the main conflict here is indeed we have a reference to Christian traditions, but Christianity is disappearing. Liberal and secular thinking is holding sway in Christian democratic parties, and at one point there comes a breaking point where the more conservative elements don't want to take it anymore.
I think that the Christian Democrats today are in such a difficult position where there's no good way to get out of it, because and there's no recipe for that, because the church is still in the same place. It is, and it should be like that, because this is the faith. This is how it was created many years ago, and church shouldn't catch up with the changing world. I fully agree. But politicians, of course, they have to fight for voters. This is politics. So they are so those who were Christian Democrats once, they are now trying to catch up the changing world, the changing societies, and I fully understand them. I mean, they cannot still speak the same language when the voters are completely different, and the world has changed completely. Yeah? The one of the main ideas of Christian democracy was belonging to community, yeah? To local community, to parish, then to national community. But now people don't want to belong to any traditional communities. They create new communities on individuals. Yeah? And so the role of family is the family model is changing a lot. Everything is changing. So the politicians are trying to catching up, and they're trying to be attractive for voters who are different than they used to be. And that's why Christian Democrats today looks completely different, some of them, than they used to look, than they were many years ago. So there's no, in Poland you can find two main parties. they sometimes call that they have some Christian democratic ideas inside. I mean, Civic Platform belongs to EPP, but most people will say, no, this is not Christian Democratic Party. Law and Justice is trying to sometimes say that they are like Christian Democrats, but also you can have doubts. So there's no. I mean, those who are calling themselves as Christian Democrats are completely different than they used to be 50 years ago. And I think there's no way back. I mean, the church should be still in the same place, but the politicians have to move on.
Yeah, look, there are these political party families in Europe which necessarily are broken down in their national contexts into very different looking and different acting entities, right? That's a consequence. I mean, if you say that the EPP has no identity, then you might as well forget about European political party families, right? But if you go, I invite all of you to go to the European Parliament and to see the debates there. Well, of course, there are clear differences between the political groups. And if I had to describe the EPP group in the European Parliament, for example, I'd say, I mean, economic competence on creating growth in a good balance between the state as a preserving force for the market, social market economy. I mean, this is one of the trademarks of the center-right, and I'm consciously going beyond the strict term Christian democracy because the EPP is larger than that.
Many other political groups also will say that this is in their core identity.
No, they are claiming, but they're wrong because and we're still the EPP.
Right,
the EPP. Hey, if I didn't think I was right, I wouldn't be sitting here. Look, the EPP.
Promise all of us believe we are.
Well, that's politics, folks. This is politics. The EPP is still the biggest political family in Europe. You know, so they've got to be doing something right, to put it that way. Now, let me continue with the trademarks. I would say on security, that's external security with defense, and that's homeland security with intelligence, police, and so on. We have a credible claim to still be one of the best, if not the best, of the political families in Europe. Third, and probably most important point, subsidiarity. I mean, I'm sure this is one of the points that Angela Merkel mentioned when she was here in Budapest, and you know, after half an hour, after half an hour had covered everything under the sun, she must have mentioned subsidiarity. In other words, the principle that politics should be made, political decisions should be taken as close as possible to the citizens, which doesn't include that national governments and European institutions take decisions, like, for example, on defense, on climate policies, and so on. But the general tendency should be as close as possible to the citizens. Subsidiarity. Now, at this point, I have my doubts about the government of this country, which is actually going to take the next step in stripping municipalities of their last vestiges of competence in health policy and education in the name of a very centralizing spirit. That's not Christian democratic, for example.
Well, I'll be very brief. I would just want to come back to the question that we started with, and you were asking, I think, what is specifically Christian about Christian democracy? And the answer is nothing. In the present situation, there is nothing that the appellation of Christian adds to what a secularist could say. So that, for example, I am a secularist. I have many criticisms of our current societies. They are criticisms that many Christians could and would make. But I don't think that it's necessary for anyone to have any particular religious faith to make those criticisms. And everything that you've just said has nothing specifically Christian about it.
those three trademarks of EPP might sound like three trademarks of European conservatives as well. And this is the problem of the current politics. I'm not blaming you. I mean, I believe that you believe in it, but also conservatives, they believe that they are the trademarks. And one comment that one of the trademarks of Christian democracy, as I understand, is the respect for others, also respect for differences, also respect for policy of different countries. And I have full respect for German politics and German differences between us and Germans. Also, I have full respect to Hungary. I mean, I may disagree, but I think also this is one of the Christian democratic features to have respect, even if we differ on some issues. And and of course I'm calling to you because I've heard many times this patronizing tone and explanation how we should act, how we should behave in the Central Europe in our countries. And I don't want to convince you that this way, the Hungarian way, is better, or Polish way is better, or German way is better. I think we should respect each other and cooperate where we can cooperate, and when we differ, we don't have to cooperate on everything.
Well, look, there's a fourth point where I'm sure the European conservatives and the EPP member parties differ, and that's the view of Europe. Because, and that brings me to the last point you said, I mean, Christian Democrats and also the liberals and conservatives in the European People's Party are very much tied to a strong European Union. That is not what European conservatives would define themselves like. And here we come to the lecturing. I'm sorry if I sounded overbearing here. I really apologize. But there are some principles that all member states signed up to in 2004 or whenever else they entered the European Union. And this is the rule of law. And this is a strong civil society. And this is independent institutions. And this is checks and balances. Everyone signed that. They also signed up to the mechanisms, how the European Union monitors this, the European institutions monitor that, right? So please don't take the monitoring about rule of law as an arrogant West European lecturing. I feel treated unfairly. I'm sorry.
I think we should start immediately talking along these lines, because then we need to start talking about what is the rule of law, who gets to define it, and these kind of things. And we also need to talk then to, well, what did we sign up to in 2004? Is what we have today what we signed up for, or has it changed in the meantime? And it's not at all anymore what we signed up for. So I think we should simply cut it out, because it has nothing to do with the subject we are talking about today, and that is the character of Christian democracy. Now, economic competence.
Absolutely, I just wanted to intervene that it's a very interesting debate to debate about the foundations of the European Union, but I think the audience has come for a debate. I think if you tell Hungarians and Polish
that their loyalty to the idea of the European Union is lacking, you are insulting them. And I think they will react very badly, because sympathy for the idea of Europe is strongest in both countries, much stronger than in some of the Western countries. I think we should not question the view in Eastern Central Europe that our place is in the European Union, and the European Union needs to be strong. But what should it look like institutionally is another question. And the change is not coming from Central Eastern Europe. The change is coming from the Western countries who want to change the structures that we signed up to. Economic competence is not a place where I can feel at home. Security is not a place where I can feel at home. Subsidiarity is such a complicated word that I cannot feel at home in it as well. And if you want to be close to the citizens, don't talk like that. I think the one thing that Christian democracy has, what others perhaps have less or had less, is a sense of belonging. It's a home. Christian democracy as a community of people who belong to a Christian European culture, in the sense that that element is weakening historically through secularization. The cohesive force of Christian democracy is weakening as well. So what we see in Hungary and Poland is an attempt to change around in a sort of culture struggle, the influence of liberal ideas in the sense that they are secular, and strengthen the idea of the Christian element of our culture. Is it a good idea or not? I don't know. I'm just stating the fact. I think I've run out of things to say.
We already heard a lot of challenges which Christian democracy is facing today, secularization and also different ideas of Christianity itself, the increasing multi-religious and multi-ethnic character of Europe. I would ask the panelists how you see the future of Christian democracy, whether it can prevail in the age of these challenges, or probably it can be the only chance for survival in the Western civilization based on the Jewish Christian culture.
Ultimately, Europe is meaningless as regards its roots, except for its Christianity. That it was the heart of Christendom. But I would also say that Catholicism means universal, and by multi-ethnic, there's a wonderful new book out at the moment which I thoroughly recommend, by Robert Cardinal Sarah, who's an African cardinal, and he critiques Western liberalism as an African very much from the perspective of an understanding of Christendom. So there's something about that unites all Catholics, and that is something which I think is the coherence in terms of fides et ratio, in terms of faith and reason, and the cohesion that Europe needs. The only alternative is a pluralism that ends up ripping itself apart, a secular fundamentalism which does not accept love in the sense the Christians understand it. It's all about me. It's narcissistic. It makes a virtue of pride, and that the future of Europe under those circumstances is grim, it's self-destructive. It will rip itself apart. There is a wonderful painting by Salvador Dali called Auto-Cannibalism, which shows how a person is basically destroying himself by consuming himself in a rather brutal fashion. That is, I think, where Europe is heading in terms of nihilism and deconstructionism, and the only answer to that is the coherence and cohesion that Christendom brings.
Will it prevail? It's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. Look, I am not sure about Christianity. Some sort of spirituality will obviously remain, and also it's been around for 2,000 years, so I have hope for the next few hundred years, but nothing remains forever. The idea of the nation as a community of people who share a language, a history, a culture, and faith, Christianity being part of that cultural heritage. I think, and it has been argued by nearly everyone who understands anything about it, that it's a construct. It's not something that we're born with, but that it is a useful construct and something that once it stands, is very cohesive and tends to last a long time. It doesn't change all that much over time. So I think the idea of the nation state in a modern way will be with us for a longer time. What I wonder about is really in terms of Europe. is, will there be one day a European identity in people where you first of all think of yourself as European, and then that you come from France or Hungary comes in second place? Maybe because your two parents were from two different ethnic groups or nations or peoples, and then maybe you yourself have married someone else. So the whole concept then would be weakening, and the concept of nation would diminish. And then, speaking about the economy and illiberal democracy, I think here's an important point that we should perhaps touch on. We have an economic transformation in the shape of globalization. How do you deal with something like Google, Amazon, and Facebook? How do you deal with global trade? Do you not need transnational political structures to regulate these things? And that would probably be the best argument for a transnational political structure in the shape of the European Union. You can also argue that modern communication is helping a global culture emerge, where English is the lingua franca, world music incorporates all musical tastes into one global music. So here we have arguments that are, I think, in favor of a post-national, maybe, European Union. On the other hand, I think that the centralization of power in countries like Poland and Hungary is simply the same, the other side of the same problem. How do you regulate these global companies? If you cannot yet do it on a transnational level, or maybe it's too difficult to do it, then you need to centralize power on the national level in order to deal with this challenge. It's very simple. You cannot deal with, by the time that you have reacted through your system of checks and balances, the markets are dead laughing. They have moved on a long time ago. So I think one reason for this phenomenon of centralization of power in some countries has to do with the question of how to deal with globalization.
It's of course it's very difficult to predict what will happen. So we can say anything, and I think we'll check whether nobody will check whether we are right or not. But if I think about the future of Christian democratic political movements, I don't see any light in the tunnel now. But it means I don't see. I don't want to say that there is no light in the tunnel, because I know that the history and everything is like sinusoid, and now we are maybe down. So in few years' time, the light will come, and I believe that the Western societies, Western culture, will survive. However, if I should look at details and facts which I'm saying now, well, it looks horrible. And it looks like in 50 years we should be taken by other invaders. But I believe that it will change. I strongly believe in the idea of nation state, and I think it will prevail for hundreds of years. Maybe one day it will disappear. But I think the roots are so strong. The differences in cultures are so strong, and it's beautiful. The differences are beautiful. I mean, this diversity. Diversity is beautiful, and respect for each other is beautiful. But also, at the same time, I'm a great fan of national state, but I'm also a great fan of this best political project probably in the modern history, so European Union. And I want to assure you that I strongly believe, and I really want EU to be strong. We definitely need it for various reasons. It doesn't mean I want to be. I don't want to have a federal Europe, but strong Europe with strong nation states cooperating with each other on many levels, absolutely needed. Good example with the multinational companies. Yeah, we cannot regulate them, and this is a huge problem in each of our countries. And I strongly believe that soon we will tax Google in all our countries, despite the American pressure. And we will not tax them just in Poland because or Hungary or Germany or something, because it's difficult. We need EU for that, and that is for this kind of reasons we need European Union.
Well, if you ask me whether Christian democratic parties will survive and thrive in the future, I would say they have a fighting chance. There's been electorally speaking, there have been 4 success stories in the last couple of years of Christian democratic parties that actually made strong gains in elections. Austria, Lithuania, Netherlands, and Croatia. And lo and behold, each case is different. The secrets of success are very different in each case. There's some emphasized more conservatism, others were very pragmatic, others went for more liberal direction, others blended these elements into a new mixture. And all of them, and this is the binding element here, all of them had new ideas for dynamic campaigning and new communication with the citizens, especially young people. And I would say, if you take all these points, these are all hints at a successful future for Christian Democrats in Europe.
Well, I would come back to the idea that there's nothing specifically Christian about most of it. And if I may come to what Joseph said, I will give a little story. I recently bought in France one of Flaubert's shorter stories. And it was in an edition that was for school children of about 16, age 16. And there were explanatory notes in this edition. And in the explanatory notes, there was an explanation of the doctrine of the Trinity and of confession. And obviously the editors felt, and I think rightly, that they actually needed to explain these things to the children of a country that was known as the oldest daughter of the church. And I think that if you ask young children now to explain these things, they would have no idea about them. And this, I think, goes to show how far things have gone in the direction of secularism in France, and the same would be true in England, incidentally. And therefore, I think that the idea that there's going to be a revival, of course, one can't say what the future is going to be. Increasingly, one can't say what the past is going to be. Actually, because I don't recognize the present historiography from the historiography that I grew up with. So it's very difficult to know what the history of our countries is going to be in 10 years' time, or even less. But I think the idea that there is going to be, if I had to guess, I don't think there is going to be a religious revival. And therefore, while Christian democratic parties may continue to exist as institutions, there will be nothing specifically Christian about them. This is just institutional survival of a kind that one sees in many institutions.
Thank you. I mean, my only response would be that we all seem to be assuming that the status quo is permanent. In other words, that liberalism is in the ascendant and will always be in the ascendant, that the culture of death is sustainable, that the radical secularism that we're living under now is something which actually has a future. So in other words, we look at the world in which we're in and we make permanent judgments and eternal judgments, if you like, upon the basis of the status quo. And one thing we should do, I think, is a really interesting exercise, is place ourselves in each of the 20 centuries since the time of Christ and look at the various factors involved. And the power of the world is always more powerful politically than the power of the saints. And yet, when you look back, it's virtue which actually sustains society, not Machiavellianism and not brutalism. And it's the works of beauty. I had the great privilege of visiting St. Stephen's Basilica today. And those edifices of beauty stand and speak for themselves. That is what Western civilization is about. And I don't think that we need to worry about the philosophy of pride and radical relativism, because it's in the process of actually killing itself.
Just a side point, very shortly. I forget his name, a Canadian scientist dealing with statistics and demography. He wrote a book called Shall the Righteous Inherit the Earth? And he pointed out that there is a built-in resiliency in all kinds of religious people, including Christians, in the way people have kids. So the very lowest reproduction rate is with liberals, people who self-declare as liberals and atheists. And then it goes on Protestants, Catholics, and at the top I think we have Orthodox and Mormons or something like that. So there would be a built-in resilience of faith groups compared with liberals.
The highest rate, of course, is amongst Muslims.
I think Mormons is what he said, or Orthodox Jews. I can't remember really, but go on.
There are more Muslim families than Mormon families on this planet.
Well, that's also true.
If I may briefly say something which is again slightly pessimistic, when there was the fire in Notre Dame, the state, which is actually the owner of Notre Dame, immediately called for architects to come and turn it into a kind of greenhouse for cannabis or some such scheme. Probably that won't happen because the population would rise up against that. But nevertheless, this is the kind of world in which we live.
Thank you for the already quite vivid discussion. But at this point, we would open the floor for the audience questions. Please, should you have any, just raise your hands and my colleagues shall assist you with the microphone. There's a gentleman at the back row.
Köszönöm szépen. Köszönjük a sokszínű véleményeket. Én két megjegyzésem lenne ahhoz a kedves úrhoz, aki mondta, és már azért az egy mondatért érdemes volt eljönnöm, hogy mi a keresztény a mai kereszténydemokráciában, és a mai kereszténydemokrata pártokban, hogy semmi. Teljes egészében egyetértek. Azzal a kitétellel, vagy kiegészítéssel inkább, hogy az ő részéről ez teljesen menthető, ugye mondta, hogy szekuláris, ha jól emlékszem, illetve tovább megyek, még aki esetleg ateistaként politizál egy kereszténydemokrata néppártban vagy mozgalomban, viszont aki kereszténynek tartja magát, és komolyan is gondolja, ez azért fontos, mert ugye a mai Európában már egyre kevésbé gondolnak komolyan bármit is az emberek, azok számára, most erős kifejezést fogok használni, nem csak egy egyszerű provokáció, tovább megyek, bűn. Egy olyan szervezetbe, egy olyan politikai mozgalomba tartozni, ami ideológiailag ennyire nihilista. Tehát, hogy konkrétan, ugye magáról is azt tudja és állítja, hogy benne nincs semmi, ami keresztény. Még egyszer mondom, ezt azokra vonatkoztatom, akik magukat kereszténynek tartják, és komolyan is gondolják. A másik rövid megjegyzés, ugyanez
So please stop because I need to translate your question to English and I try to just summarize it very shortly. So please, if you can ask it in English, I would ask you to summarize it, otherwise I will raise your question to the panelists.
Nem, magyarul folytatnám.
Okay, then I will raise your question and probably then if we will have time, because no one else. No, I would like to translate your question.
Okay, I'm waiting for it.
He referred to the sentence raised by the panelists that there's nothing Christian in Christian democracy and in Christian democratic parties, and if someone has a strong devotion in faith, then it's his sin actually to connect to a party which is so nihilist and which is so which has so left its core values,
it's
religious values.
For a Christian to be a Christian Democrat is what he said. But that was not a question, was it?
Jó, bocsánat, akkor mondanám, rövid leszek, csak az nagyon fontos még. Ugyanez az úriemberhez, aki ugye föltette a kérdést, hogy ha egy beteg vagy nagyon szenvedő embert látunk, és mi az az ok, vagy mondjuk egyetlen egy okot rá, hogy miért kéne megmenteni az életét, ha ugye látjuk az utcán, és miért kéne nem hagyni, hogy meghalljon. Hát én találtam egy indokot. Volt valaki annak idején, aki azt mondta, hogy arról ismernek meg titeket, hogy a tanítványaim vagytok, hogy szeretitek egymást. Ha esetleg nem jutna eszébe ez a kedves, különös úriember, úgy hívták, hogy Názáreti Jézus. Köszönöm, csak ennyit.
So, yes, he made another comment that the one reason, if nothing else, for rescuing somebody who's dying on the street should be based on the words of Jesus that people will know you by loving each other and caring for each other. That's also a comment. I don't know whether you would like to comment on this, or we can move on.
Valakinek holnap le kell győzni a sötétséget. So, it's one of the 2 or 3 phrases I know. It means someone will have to vanquish the darkness. Thank you. Someone will have to vanquish the darkness tomorrow. So, in response to the point by the gentleman, I could only respectfully answer that I don't share your point of view. And we agree to disagree. To me, it's clear, and I wrote an article together with my boss, Mikuláš Dzurinda, former Prime Minister of Slovakia, why Christian Democrats have to defend liberal democracy. So that's where I come from. I realize you are somewhere else. You would call me a sinner. I have to live with that.
Okay, then please. First, I would like to give the microphone for the gentleman in the first row.
Thank you, gentlemen, for coming tonight. I'll try and phrase my question, although I have to admit I struggle because Christian democracy, I don't really understand. The last thing in politics I understood was Christian monarchy. So therefore my question, I think, also relates to that. I think when we had kings in this country as well, our last one was Charles IV, the Emperor, it was a political system where truth, as fundamental part of Christianity, prevailed. Now, you, Mr. Freudenstein, said that the EPP is a majority in Europe. They got to be doing something right. Respectfully, there has been quite a few parties in Europe, also many dictatorships where the majority time to time agreed. So my question really is, if you assume that the hill of Jerusalem is truth, and what they want to call Greece, whether it's a place for doubt or it's a place of philosophy that supports Christian teaching in Europe, how do you think is Christian democracy possible when within Christianity we have a truth that historically has been again and again, I think, rejected by the majority? And even nowadays, whether you want to call yourself a Christian within a Christian Democratic Party or not, there seems to be this constant issue whether what we are saying is actually Christian or just Christian in the sense of the Christian Democratic Union. And it's not necessarily addressed to you, the question, you can all comment, but really the relationship between truth and majority. Thank you.
Yes, if I may. First of all, I found myself in a singular situation a few moments ago when America was mentioned and everyone looked at me. I'm actually an Englishman, and I'm much more used to, in America, when I live in America, that when people talk about the Englishman, all the Americans look at me. So this was a new experience for me. But on saying that, I would like to, one political concept in the United States, and I'm not a great believer in the American political system. I'm very skeptical about that as well. But the idea of one nation under God is important. In other words, that the alternative is there is no truth, ultimately. And if there's no truth, ultimately, there's nothing that can unite us, ultimately, except perhaps pernicious ideologies like Marxism and National Socialism, radical relativism, the philosophy of pride, which we see now. And we know the track record of that. And for all that, the Inquisition was mentioned earlier, but the Inquisition was nothing compared to the 200 years of secularist inheritance with communism, the French Revolution, the Great Terror, Nazism. We're talking about tens of millions of people killed in the name of a creedless, ultimately meaningless ideologies. So we do have to acknowledge that there's a natural law. that natural law comes from God, and it was referred to as the dignity of the human person, is something which only has its roots in an understanding of man as being made in the image of God. If you take that away, then we are merely animals that can be killed at whim, as secularists have killed us at whim in the past.
You've mentioned something that doesn't keep me awake at night, but I deeply worry about this whole phenomenon of people, how shall I say, reacting to opinions of voters as expressed in elections as a problem. How can they be so wrong? How can they not know the truth, right? And I think that is a very dangerous thing road to embark on. And we have it on all sides of the political spectrum nowadays. We used to have a time when there's an election, and then we ask, what is the voter's meaning? What does he want us to do? He's the sovereign. And today we have elections, and afterwards everyone says, oh no, how could voters be so stupid again and get it so wrong? They are not wrong, they are right, and we must understand what they want. So they tend to be much more right than elites. World War I did not happen because citizens wanted it. It was because intellectual elites of all the countries involved thought that it was not a problem, because we can't have a big war, it will be bad for the economy. If we have a war, it will be short. We did not have Hitler in Germany because he won an election. He never had a majority. It's because conservative elites made him a chancellor without him having a majority in the population. So I think let's not embark on this quest for an absolute truth. When we talk about democracy, voters get to decide and they react to realities.
I would just like to remind you that Christianity itself is capable of many different political interpretations, and I was for a time in Latin America when there was something called liberation theology, which was almost indistinguishable from Marxism, except that it claimed that that if more or less, if Jesus were alive today, he would have been a Central American guerrilla. And so that Christianity itself is capable of more than one political interpretation.
I would point out, however, that liberation theology was condemned by St. John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. So, yeah, of course, many people that call themselves Christians can have many sorts of opinions, but that doesn't mean that that all of those are authentic or bona fide.
But then if you're saying they're not authentic, then you're arguing for what you can say is authentic, and that can lead to a theocracy, which you probably wouldn't want to live under either. And would certainly not be Christian Democrat. Well, maybe I would mind, shall we say, and that would not be Christian democratic in any conceivable way.
If I may, just as a response, I would call myself a Christian and a Democrat. But again, one thing we haven't done this evening is actually define our terms very well. So that's part of the problem, I think. But obviously, I define myself as a Christian, as somebody who subscribes to the teaching authority of the Catholic Church, to the Church's magisterium. I call myself a Democrat because I believe in subsidiarity, and I believe that the government should reflect and represent the views and will of the people. And that any tyrant, whether that tyrant is a dictator or an institution, such as I would argue the European Union is, or a king, that there's no divine right of any of those entities to run roughshod over the will of the people. So, but I believe that government needs to be small and close to the people. I believe that power has to be devolved away from big central government to small local government. That's the sort of democracy, that grassroots democracy, which is in keeping with the social encyclicals referred to earlier, Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, Pius XI's Quadragesimo Anno, that we need grassroots democracy from the grassroots up, from localities upwards, from the family outwards.
So we have time for one last question, and the gentleman at the back signed his intention the earliest.
Thanks a million. My question is far from politics, as my profession is history and art history. A few years ago I wrote a paper about Mikhail Afanasyevich Bulgakov. Probably most of us knows Master and Margarita and the Dog's Heart and famous theatric scenes, and hypothetically I made a funny question: is Bulgakov was a Christian Democrat? By functionally what he believed, what he wrote, his identity was for sure Christian, and for sure he was a free spirit. And if he could choose, he would live in a democratic society. By the way, Josef Vissarionowitch Dzsugashvili, Stalin, Koba liked him. So how come Stalin liked a Christian Democrat? What is the reason and what is the psychological and sociocultural environment when such a person like Bulgakov can survive, and why? And if Bulgakov would live in United Kingdom, Germany or Hungary today, if he could make such a special messages as he did in his theatric scenes and especially in Master and Margarita and the Dog's Heart. So my question to you, if you know the piece Master and Margarita, and another hypothetical question, and that's my question to you, that there is Dr. Roland, and Dr. Roland looks like protecting fundamental Christian democratic values. He's tried to convince communists that God is existing, Christianity as existing, and hell and heaven also existing. And he turns into the dualism that if we are Christian Democrats, we could work together with God and devil also, if we believe in these two entities, definitely, or if we don't believe, when we are getting scared that this entity is appearing in our life as a human person or as a collective community, could be a country, a political entity, a continent, etc. So my question to you, it's a metaphysical...
Could you please just in 5 words conclude your question?
Please accept my apology, I beg your pardon. So, do you think in the future of European politics or Western civilization where you are in, is there any chance to metaphysical approach? And if we are Christian Democrats, think like Bulgakov or such Russian thinkers like Dostoevsky or maybe Chekhov or Tolstoy, I believe they were Europeans and they are still. So that's my question to you. Metaphysically, do we have a chance to get back to the core values of these qualities like Christianity, okay. God, and devil? Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that question. I mean, that was a challenge. And you know, I mean, if you ask me, are these 4 authors that you named, are they Europeans? Yes, by all means. Are they Christian Democrats? I don't know, but. Let's pick out Dostoevsky, who I classify as one of the precursors of the pathology that is haunting Russia today, including, by the way, the Orthodox Church, which plays a very nefarious role in a pathological definition of Russia and Russia's role in the world. So Dostoevsky was anti-Western. And as such, he certainly was European, but he was not a Christian Democrat, and he certainly was not a Democrat. Period. So so that would be my short answer to your question, to your very long question.
I have two very short things. If there is a creational God, if we live in a created world, there's no chance we will not notice by the end of days. If there isn't, then there's a chance that we will come to the conclusion that there isn't. When Stalin died, I think Beria was the only one allowed into his room, and then some doctors came and other functionaries, and they started saying bad things about him as he lay dying because he had had a stroke, but he was still able to hear, and he understood the bad things that they were saying about him, and he raised his finger to the sky. God hears you.
one Russian writer that wasn't mentioned was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I had the privilege of going to Moscow to meet him. I wrote a biography of Solzhenitsyn called A Soul in Exile. And I would say that he is himself, first of all, he stated specifically, he said, people say that I'm anti-Western. I'm not anti-Western. I think Russia is part of the West. Russia is part of Western culture. He said if the Iron Curtain had come down and all of the cream of Western civilization had seeped over the top to penetrate Russia, he would have rejoiced. He said, but the Iron Curtain went up and all of the scum of Western culture came in under the bottom, and that's the problem. But he considered himself to be a Westerner. And I would also say that, you know, when he was lying in prison under Stalin in 1948, the same time that that George Orwell was writing 1984, no one in their right mind would have thought that one individual prisoner in the Soviet prison system could impact the world in such a way as that one man did. And I would say that is something which is very encouraging, that each of us as individuals can change the world, and that's how we actually make the world a better place, is by doing it as individuals.
If I may just respond very briefly. Actually, Solzhenitsyn didn't reveal anything to the world that the world couldn't have known before. What changed was the world being willing to hear the message. I have collected books about the Soviet Union in the written in the 1920s and 30s, and absolutely everything was known from the beginning. What changed was the willingness to believe it. So I don't think Solzhenitsyn alone did actually change the world in that fashion. To come back to the gentleman's question about metaphysics, we are all metaphysicians whether we like it or not, because we all have metaphysics. Everything that we say has some kind of metaphysical basis, whether or not we acknowledge that it has. And of course, we are probably none of us able to formulate a completely consistent metaphysics, because I don't think anybody ever has. But I certainly wouldn't want to live in a world where an officially imposed metaphysic was the basis of a political system or a state, because I think that way leads to disaster. If I may mention about also Stalin, all dictators, all tyrants tolerate fools, court jesters, and there were many people he didn't tolerate. He was also actually very keen on Mozart, but that I don't think really makes us change our opinion of Stalin.
Well, I'm afraid that we need to conclude the discussion at this point. Thank you for this very informative and lively discussion, and also for the engagement of the audience and for enriching it. Our next event will be on the 22nd of January. Further details will come soon. For further information, please subscribe to our mailing list, visit our website, or just follow us on Facebook or Twitter. When you leave the room, please drop your filled-in feedback forms in a glass box and return your interpreter devices. And thank you for joining us. Stay tuned and have a good night. And of course, the MCC crew wish you a very Merry Christmas and a successful and Happy New Year.